There are cities that never sleep, and then there are cities that never forget. Once, this valley of light and shadow was ruled by a man whose name echoed across continents. A man who built an empire out of fear, loyalty, and dust. But long after his death, his presence remained, woven into the walls, whispered in the streets, and carried by the wind that rolls down from the green mountains of Antioquia. This is not the story of Pablo Escobar, not really. It is the story of what he left behind. A city learning to breathe again. A people reclaiming their memory from the ghosts that tried to define them. Tonight we walk through Medellin's quiet hours, through neighborhoods reborn from ash, through murals painted over bullet holes, through silence that once belonged to fear and now belongs to peace. Because sometimes history is not about the wars we fight, but about what happens after. This is the ghost of Medellín, the city Pablo left behind. It began in the valley. Long before the headlines, before the gunfire and the myth, there was Medellín, a city folded into the mountains, wrapped each morning in mist and the scent of roasted coffee. The air was heavy with patience. Trains and buses wheezed through the streets, carrying men in worn jackets and women with baskets balanced on their hips. Life moved slowly then, as if the valley itself were breathing. Medellín in the 1970s was not yet the city of fear it would become. It was a city of workers, textile makers, bricklayers, shop owners, and of dreamers who looked up at the white-walled mansions on the lower hills and imagined another kind of life. The rich lived behind iron gates. The poor built higher and higher into the hills, where the air thinned and the rain was colder. From those heights, the city looked almost peaceful. Thousands of yellow windows shimmered like stars below, hiding the distances between wealth and want. Families crowded into one-room houses. Yet on Sundays, the barrios filled with laughter, the smell of grilled arepas con queso, and the echo of footballs kicked down narrow alleys. Beneath that laughter, though, lived a quiet ache. For generations, people had waited for someone to notice them, for a government that never came, for justice that always belonged to someone else. In the barrios, survival was a full-time occupation, and dignity a kind of rebellion. It was in this place, divided by altitude and fortune, that the storm began to form. Not suddenly, but like clouds thickening over the valley, unnoticed until the first thunder cracked. Among the young men of the hills was one whose hunger was different. He sold contraband cigarettes from Panama, radios off the back of trucks. He was clever, polite, and dangerous in his patience. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, a boy from Rio Negro who believed power could be built like a house, brick by brick, deal by deal. At first, he was no legend, just another hustler trying to turn smuggling into something grander. Yet those who met him spoke later of the eyes, calm, calculating, untouched by fear. Even then, he seemed to see the entire city as a map of possibilities. By the late 70s, the valley had begun to change. The money moving through its narrow streets no longer came from factories or small shops. It came from elsewhere, from the green fields beyond the mountains, from invisible routes that threaded through jungle and desert. It came on the backs of mules, inside trucks, and later, through the air. To most, it was still rumor, whispers carried in the cafes of El Poblado, in the pool halls of Envigado. But the young men of the barrios began to notice something new. Friends who once patched shoes or washed cars were suddenly buying motorcycles, watches, and land. Their pockets jingled with American coins. The poor were becoming rich overnight, and no one asked too many questions. The boy from Rio Negro was watching. He had learned early that power wasn't seized in the open. It was gathered quietly, piece by piece, in favors owed and debts collected. Escobar built alliances with truckers, police officers, and smugglers who owed him their comfort. He paid well, and more importantly, he remembered every name. The first shipments of white powder were small, barely enough to draw attention. But the profit was staggering. A kilo purchased for a few thousand in Peru could sell for tens of thousands in Miami. The valley became a vein pumping riches into the heart of a new empire. Medellín, once a city of textiles, was turning into a city of ghosts. The people noticed changes not in the newspapers, but in the rhythm of their neighborhoods. Houses grew taller, churches filled with new donations. A boy who once swept the plaza now drove a new Toyota. It was said almost proudly that the poor of Medellín had found their Robin Hood. Escobar gave generously, but never freely. He built football fields on the hills, handed out cash, constructed houses where shacks once stood. But every brick laid carried his name. In return for his kindness, the people offered loyalty, not just gratitude, but devotion. They called him El Patron. The city's government pretended not to see. Officials accepted envelopes, and businessmen accepted protection. Medellín's underworld began to seep through its very foundations. Those who resisted found their doors marked with bullets. Those who cooperated found their pockets full. Yet in those years, before the true violence began, the city was suspended in an uneasy grace. Music still filled the plazas. Lovers still met by the fountains. And from the hills, Escobar looked down at the glittering valley, like a king surveying a kingdom not yet his, but already promised. No one could yet see the shadow that was forming, the kind of darkness that doesn't arrive all at once, but leaks slowly, like ink spreading through water. Medellín, blowing under 1,000 streetlights, was already sinking into that shadow. Power does not declare itself in a single moment. It gathers, unseen, beneath the surface. In whispers, in favors, in the weight of fear. By the early 1980s, Medellín had begun to kneel to an invisible crown. Pablo Escobar's name was not yet spoken loudly, but it was known in every barrio, every office, every police station. It drifted like perfume and poison in the same breath. In the heart of the valley, men in polished shoes and dark suits began to meet in quiet rooms. They were lawyers, accountants, and pilots. They spoke of routes, not morals, of payloads, not people. In their ledgers, profit replaced conscience. Escobar had given them purpose, and in exchange, they gave him structure. Every empire begins with organization, and Pablo understood that better than any politician. The Cartel de Medellín was less a criminal gang and more a corporation of shadows. Planes left the jungles of Colombia and returned as gold. Whole villages existed to serve a single route. Farmers, pilots, soldiers, all fed the machine. For the people of Medellín, the change was visible in sudden miracles. The poor were building homes with tiled floors. Children walked to school in clean uniforms, paid for by men they never met. Entire neighborhoods rose overnight. Escobar called them Barrios de Esperanza, neighborhoods of hope, and in each one a small mural appeared, a mustached face, soft eyes, a half-smile that seemed almost kind. But the hope he gave carried a cost. Loyalty was currency, and in Medellín, nothing was free. The people, grateful and desperate, began to see their benefactor not as a man but as a savior. They whispered prayers to him as they once did to saints. Escobar's image hung beside crucifixes. The line between faith and fear grew thin. In politics, he found his stage. He had the charisma of a preacher, the generosity of a king, and the ruthlessness of a man who could not be denied. In 1982, Pablo Escobar was elected to Colombia's Congress. For a brief, shimmering moment, the world saw him not as a criminal but as a reformer, a man of the people. He promised to lift the poor from misery, to build roads, schools, and hospitals. His speeches were filled with warmth and conviction. But behind the words, a quiet war was already beginning, a war of power, reputation, and survival. Colombia's elites, who had laughed at the boy from the hills, began to feel a chill. The intruder had entered their house. When the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, publicly denounced Escobar as a narco, the illusion shattered. Cameras captured Escobar's face as reporters cornered him, the small smile gone, replaced by the cold gaze of a man unaccustomed to defiance. A few weeks later, Lara was dead. Two men on motorcycles ended the debate. From that moment, the city began to tremble. The newspapers dared not speak his name. Those who did vanished. Medellín's journalists learned to write between the lines, their pens trembling over typewriters. Fear became as common as air, invisible, inescapable. Yet even as the blood began to flow, Escobar's legend only deepened. To the poor, he remained their protector. To the rich, their nightmare. To the world, a mystery. Medellín stood divided, one half blessing his name, the other whispering it only in fear. The city had become his reflection, beautiful, corrupt, and quietly doomed. And above it all, Escobar built his palace, Hacienda Nápoles, a dream of excess rising from the jungle, with marble fountains, rare animals, and gates crowned with a replica of the plane that had brought his first fortune. He walked its corridors barefoot, the king of a world both real and imagined. He had everything. Yet in the quiet hours, standing by the pool under a sleepless sky, he could still hear the hum of the city that had made him. Medellín, his child, his mirror, his curse. By the mid-1980s, Medellín no longer slept. It lay awake each night, listening for the sound that everyone feared but no one could predict. The burst of gunfire, the muffled explosion, the shriek of tires disappearing into the dark. What had begun as ambition had turned into rule by uncertainty. The city had become both throne and prison. For the people, life continued because it had to. The buses still climbed the hills each morning, crowded with men in work uniforms and women clutching bags of groceries. Children still played football in the dust, though their laughter was quieter now, glancing over shoulders that once knew only sunlight. Fear had no face, only presence. It lived in unspoken things, in the neighbor who suddenly moved away, in the man who stopped opening his shop, in the house that stayed dark for weeks. No one asked questions anymore. Questions were dangerous. Answers, even more so. The cartel's power ran through the city like electricity. It lit homes, filled pockets, and kept the poor alive. But it also shocked. punishing anyone who touched the wrong wire. In the barrios, young men vanished between one heartbeat and the next. The people learned a new kind of silence, not from obedience, but from survival. And yet life still carried beauty. On Sunday mornings, church bells echoed over the valley. Lovers met in secret corners. Families gathered around radio soap operas, clinging to the illusion of normalcy. Even in darkness, humanity persisted like a candle shielded by trembling hands. Escobar's reach had grown beyond borders. His wealth was measured not in numbers, but in influence. Generals, judges, mayors, all moving within his gravity. Medellín was no longer merely his home, it was his kingdom of quiet obedience. But power, once absolute, begins to devour itself. Rivals rose from within, old allies now hungering for their share. The police, pressured by foreign governments, tightened their grip, and the people, though loyal, began to feel exhaustion deeper than fear. The kind of fatigue that seeps into the soul. The city's skyline, once radiant with ambition, now seemed to tremble under a gray haze. Helicopters hovered where once only clouds drifted. The air itself had become suspicious. Yet, beneath the noise, there were still moments of quiet. A mother braiding her daughter's hair. An old man tuning his radio to a love song from another decade. Escobar himself had changed. The smile that once charmed the poor had hardened. He no longer walked through the barrios as freely. His visits became myth, stories told and retold like sightings of a saint. Some swore he still watched over them. Others feared he watched everyone. Outside, the war grew louder. Bombings and assassinations began to stitch the fabric of daily life. No corner felt untouched. The city moved as if holding its breath, each heartbeat a negotiation with fate. And yet, the people of Medellín endured. They learned to live within the echo, to measure their lives not by peace, but by the spaces between chaos. In those spaces, they laughed, loved, and dreamed, because to stop dreaming was to surrender completely. Fear became ordinary, hope extraordinary. The city was both, a contradiction that pulsed through every street and heart. In that contradiction, Medellín survived. And somewhere in the quiet hills, its self-made king began to feel the same tremor that haunted his people. The awareness that no empire, however mighty, can outlast the patience of time. By the early 1990s, the air in Medellín had changed again. It was thicker, quieter, like the valley itself was holding a breath. The city had grown tired, tired of fear, tired of waiting for dawn that never seemed to come. For a decade, one man's shadow had stretched across the mountains. Now it began, at last, to tremble. Pablo Escobar had become both legend and ghost. His fortune was beyond measure, his power immense, but isolation had become his prison. Surrounded by walls of his own making, the king could no longer see the faces of the people who once cheered for him. His laughter grew quieter, his circle smaller. The government that once feared him had learned patience. Pressure came not from within, but from beyond Colombia's borders. Nations demanded justice. Generals plotted quietly. The hunt for Escobar was no longer a rumor, it was an industry. Entire divisions existed for one purpose, to end the story that had begun in the hills. For the people of Medellín, the war was invisible and constant. Streets that had once echoed with children's laughter now carried whispers of curfews and checkpoints. But beneath the fear was something new, a quiet, hesitant hope. The idea that maybe, someday soon, the city might belong to itself again. Escobar, ever proud, built his own fortress, La Catedral, a prison in name only. There, surrounded by his own guards and comforts, he believed himself untouchable. From its hilltop walls he could still see the city that had birthed him, glittering below like a constellation. His creation, his kingdom, his fading dream. But time is the enemy of all empires. His alliances splintered, his rivals turned. The same networks that once moved his fortune now carried betrayal. Each day brought new rumors, new names scratched from ledgers. The city that had once bowed began to stand, hesitantly, in defiance. When Escobar escaped from La Catedral, the illusion shattered completely. Medellín erupted, not in celebration, not in terror, but in exhaustion. The chase began anew. Helicopters hovered day and night, their blades cutting the sky like endless warnings. The mountains themselves seemed to echo with the search. He became a phantom, slipping between safe houses, always one step ahead, always watched. Those who had once protected him now turned their eyes away. Money could no longer buy safety. Loyalty had become a burden. Medellín watched from behind shuttered windows, waiting for an ending no one dared to imagine. And then, one December afternoon, the silence broke. The valley shuddered, not with celebration, but with the strange stillness that follows a long-held breath. News spread like wind. The man who had ruled the city from its darkest corners was gone. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a name whispered and a sense of release that felt almost like grief. For many, it was not joy they felt, but uncertainty. Who would they become without the shadow that had defined them? The children who had grown up under Escobar's reign knew no other world. Freedom felt unfamiliar, a sky too wide, a silence too deep. Medellín did not celebrate loudly. It exhaled. The city, for the first time in years, slept through the night. And when dawn came, it arrived without thunder, without the hum of fear. Only the soft noise of rain on the valley floor, gentle, forgiving, endless. In the quiet that followed, people began to rebuild, not walls, but trust. The markets reopened, the laughter returned, cautious but real. The city began to remember itself. Escobar's name lingered, not as a legend, but as a warning. His empire had given the poor dreams and the rich fear, but it had taken from all of them something irreplaceable: peace. Medellín would never be the same, and perhaps that was its salvation. From the ruins of its shadow it learned light, from fear, resilience, from silence, voice. The king had fallen, but the city endured. And in that endurance there was something sacred, not triumph, but quiet survival. In the years that followed, the city began to heal, though the scars never truly faded. Medellín, once the most feared place on earth, began to rediscover its pulse, slow, uncertain, but alive. The walls that once whispered of war now carried murals of peace, color blooming where silence had taken root. People spoke of those years in hushed tones, not out of fear, but reverence. The city had looked death in the eye and survived. It had seen its own reflection in blood and money, and still found the courage to rise. There was no forgetting, but there was forgiveness, born slowly in the rhythm of ordinary life. Those who had lived through it often said that Medellín was not just a place, but a feeling, a strange, unbroken heart beating between mountains. Every street, every sound, every scent carried a memory of what once was. The roar of a motorcycle, the smell of gasoline, the echo of footsteps, all ghosts of an age gone by. But beneath the memories was something older, a stubborn will to endure. The people of Medellín had learned that resilience is not loud. It is quiet, almost invisible. It hides in the way mothers wake before dawn to make arepas, in the way students walk to school with hope in their eyes, in the laughter that returns like a slow, gentle tide. The city became a lesson the world did not expect. From the ashes of fear rose innovation, art, and renewal. The same hills that once hid the poor now held libraries. The neighborhoods that had been forgotten became centers of light. Escalators climbed where guns once ruled, carrying children upward, not just through the city, but into the future. Medellín began to redefine itself, not as a city of crime, nor of sorrow, but as a city of rebirth. Its story was not one of glory or ruin, but of transformation, a reminder that even the darkest places can learn to breathe again. In the quiet corners of the city, the older generations still tell stories. Of the boy from Rio Negro who built an empire from dust. Of the years when everyone lived half in light, half in shadow. Of the nights when the city did not sleep. They speak not with hatred nor pride, but with the weary grace of those who have seen too much and learned to keep going. The children listen, not quite understanding. To them, Escobar is only a name, a distant echo, a cautionary tale. Their Medellín is different, one filled with music, art, and ambition. The weight of the past still lingers, but it no longer dictates the rhythm of their days. Some nights, when the air is still and the mountains seem to lean close, you can almost hear the city exhale, a deep, tired sigh that turns slowly into a breath of peace. Medellín, the city that lived in shadows, now glows quietly in the light it built for itself. History remembers Pablo Escobar for his empire, his violence, his fortune. But Medellín remembers itself, not through him, but beyond him. It remembers the quiet mornings, the scent of rain on the mountains, the resilience that outlived the fear. And in that remembrance, it finds what power never could: peace, humble and unbroken. The city wakes slowly, not in a rush, not in panic, just slowly, as if testing the air. Medellín, once called the most dangerous city in the world, now opens its eyes to another quiet morning. The ghosts of the past are still here, but they no longer frighten anyone. They linger, like old songs that refuse to fade from memory. It has been decades since Pablo Escobar's fall, yet his name still floats like dust through the city's air, too familiar to forget, too painful to fully remember. For the generation that lived through his reign, the silence that followed his death was heavier than the violence itself. For those born after, he is a story, part myth, part warning. There's a certain stillness in the valley now. The hills that once echoed with gunfire carry only the sound of rain. The air feels different, cleansed, almost shy. The city doesn't roar anymore. It hums, quietly, like an old man murmuring prayers before dawn. And yet, beneath that calm, there is something unresolved, a question that no one dares to ask aloud. What does it mean to outlive your own legend? Pablo Escobar once dreamed of ruling Colombia. He imagined himself not as a criminal, but as a savior, a man who would rewrite history through power. And for a time he did. His empire stretched from jungles to skyscrapers, from dusty runways to the marble halls of politicians. Yet now, all that remains is absence, an echo in the stones, a silence that hums through the city he once owned.
Those who lived through those years say the quietest moments were the hardest. When the gunfire stopped, people didn't celebrate. They listened. They waited, unsure if peace could be trusted. Children grew up measuring safety by the sounds outside their windows. A barking dog meant normalcy. A car idling too long meant danger. Fear had become language. Today, the same streets are filled with color. Graffiti spills across the walls, faces of peace, murals of forgiveness. The people of Medellín, instead of burying their past, painted over it. They turned scars into symbols. The city became an art gallery of survival. Tourists come now, not to chase crime legends, but to see how a city can rebuild its soul. But Medellín has not forgotten. Memory here is not erased. It's negotiated. Escobar's ghost lingers in stories whispered between generations. Some still remember the man who built houses for the poor, who handed out money at Christmas. Others remember the fear, the blood, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath when his name was spoken. Both memories are true. Every city carries its ghosts. Medellín's ghost does not haunt its nights. It haunts its mornings, in the way sunlight touches the old walls, in the way people look forward while remembering to look back. It's easy to romanticize history. It's harder to live with it. Escobar's story has been retold in movies and series, his image flattened into pop culture. A face on shirts, a myth sold to tourists. But for Medellín, it's not nostalgia. It's inheritance. His empire wasn't just cocaine and cash. It was the architecture of fear, the shaping of a city's identity. Somewhere, deep in the hills, the ruins of his estate stand silent. Nature has taken it back. The fountains are dry, the marble cracked. The zoo he built for his children is overgrown with vines. A single bird call echoes through the empty courtyards. Time has done what armies and governments could not. It made him small again. But Medellín's real transformation didn't come from politicians or policies. It came from its people, from the mothers who kept families together when the streets fell silent, from the teachers who returned to classrooms after years of fear, from the young artists who painted what others could not say. The city rebuilt itself through ordinary grace. The world looks at Medellín now and sees innovation. The cable cars that climb the mountains, the parks where violence once reigned. But beneath every triumph lies the whisper of what it cost. Peace here is not an absence of pain. It's a daily act of remembering without surrendering. And still, at night, when the city quiets and the last train passes, the valley hums with something deeper than silence, a heartbeat that belongs to both the living and the gone. The ghost of Medellín does not frighten, it reminds. It stands between past and present, watching the city it once nearly destroyed find its way back to light. Somewhere, someone turns off their radio, closing another day. The wind brushes against the hills, the city sleeps, not forgetting, not forgiven, but at peace.
at least for now. Long before the world spoke the name Escobar, the valley of Medellín was already chasing dreams of gold. The city was born from ambition, not greed exactly, but a restless desire for progress, for something more than the mountains allowed. In the 19th century, miners came here seeking ore. In the 20th, the people came seeking work. And by the 1980s, they sought survival. Every generation in Medellín inherited that same hunger. It was written into the soil, a need to rise above the valley, to reach the sun beyond the peaks. Escobar did not invent that dream. He merely twisted it. The city's longing for prosperity became his raw material. Its faith in the impossible, his foundation. In the 1970s, Medellín was called the industrial capital of Colombia. The city glowed with promise. Textile mills, new highways, commerce booming in the valley. But the higher it climbed, the more it left behind. The hillside barrios, the rural poor, the forgotten. Up in those hills, dreams and desperation shared the same roof. It was there, in the unseen edges of the city, that Pablo Escobar's legend began to take shape. He was a son of the valley, not of wealth, but of will. Born in Rio Negro and raised in Envigado, young Pablo saw both worlds, the privilege of the few and the hunger of the many. The city taught him its first and greatest lesson, that success was not inherited, but taken. In Medellín, power was not given to dreamers. It belonged to those who dared to seize it. The city in those days was changing faster than its people could keep up. Old family wealth began to fade, and a new class of hustlers emerged. Men who sold contraband cigarettes, stolen cars, and eventually, white powder. They called it the new gold. Cocaine turned the air electric, the valley into a trading floor of dreams and danger. For the poor, Escobar's rise was not shocking. It was familiar. He was one of them. He built soccer fields, schools, and homes. He handed out cash on Christmas Eve. In barrios where no government official ever came, Escobar's men did. To many, he wasn't a criminal. He was proof that the valley's forgotten could defy its fate. But every miracle comes with a shadow. The money that built playgrounds also built prisons. The man who gave food also gave orders that took lives. His empire grew like ivy, fast, beautiful, and suffocating. The city that once dreamed of gold now dreamed of survival. Escobar's wealth was staggering, almost mythical. Dollars piled in warehouses, buried in fields, hidden in walls. For the first time in history, Medellín became the epicenter of a global economy built on something invisible, a powder that traveled farther than any empire ever had. And yet within that empire, there was fear, quiet, constant, contagious. The government called him a criminal. The poor called him Don Pablo. The truth lay somewhere between, a man shaped by the same forces that shaped the city. He was Medellín's mirror, brilliant, brutal, and endlessly ambitious. The same hunger that built textile factories and schools also built his empire. The same dream of gold now turned to dust. There's a strange beauty in contradiction. Medellín in the 1980s was both paradise and purgatory. The mountains glowed with sunlight, while the streets ran with fear. Yet the people still went to work, still celebrated birthdays. That is perhaps the most human truth. Life goes on, even when it shouldn't. Meanwhile, deep in his luxurious estate, Escobar played a different kind of game. He built his own kingdom, complete with zoo, racetrack, lakes, and private army. He was a man pretending to be a nation, but power, once tasted, demands tribute. The gold that once dazzled the valley now burned it. To the world outside, Medellín became a headline. To those inside, it was a heartbeat that would not steady. Foreign journalists came, cameras followed, and the name Medellín became synonymous with chaos. Yet even then, life persisted. The resilience of street vendors, the patience of mothers, the laughter of children who played beside bullet holes. The valley had dreamed of gold and found it, though not the kind it expected. Escobar's empire shone bright for a brief moment, then burned everything around it. But even as the flames rose, the people of Medellín learned something essential: that the city itself was stronger than the man who tried to own it. And so, history turned. The dream that began in the soil of the valley was about to meet its reckoning. Escobar's rise had reached its peak, and from here, every echo would begin to fall. But in the quiet corners of Medellín, among its people, hope had already started to take root once more. The narrator whispers, almost tenderly, the city that dreamed of gold had found it, lost it, and learned that its true treasure was endurance. By the early 1990s, the city no longer whispered Pablo Escobar's name. It flinched at it. Medellín had become a stage for its own tragedy. Every day, another headline, another explosion, another family mourning. It was not just violence that consumed the valley, it was exhaustion. The people were tired of fear, of hope, of waiting for an end that never seemed to arrive. At first, many believed Escobar could not fall. His empire had woven itself into every corner of society. Politicians, policemen, priests, pilots. He was not just a man, he was a network, a rumor, a currency. But even empires built on gold and fear are fragile. They collapse not from outside attack, but from within, from the slow corrosion of loyalty. Some of Escobar's men began to disappear, defecting, surrendering, dying. The government had declared war not only through bullets, but through patience. They hunted not the king, but his reflection, the myth that made him untouchable. In time, that myth began to crack. Yet, even as the city trembled, life persisted. Morning markets still opened. Children still walked to school. The resilience of Medellín's people was quiet but unbreakable, a daily defiance of despair. They learned to live between gunfire and laughter, between curfews and fiestas, between grief and survival. To outsiders, Medellín was chaos, a war zone of headlines and statistics. But to those within, it was home. Fear became a rhythm, something to dance around, something to endure. The people found poetry in their persistence. Even the graffiti spoke in riddles. From pain, we build. Escobar's ghost began to separate from his body long before his death. Each bombing, each betrayal, stripped him of his invincibility. He became less of a ruler and more of a hunted legend. The same city that had once adored him now prayed for distance. Even those who still admired him in secret spoke his name only behind closed doors. As the violence escalated, the people of Medellín developed a new superstition, the belief that silence could protect them. No one spoke too loudly. No one lingered too long near strangers. Words became dangerous. in a city where sound once defined life, laughter, music, argument. Silence became its new anthem. Escobar himself had become a prisoner of his own myth. Surrounded by guards, trapped in safe houses, he no longer ruled. He hid. The man who once walked through Medellín as its king now moved like a shadow through his own city, hunted by his creation. And yet, even in those final years, his influence remained everywhere. In the neighborhoods he built, in the fear that governed daily life, in the strange affection some still held for him. Escobar was not just a man. He had become a wound that refused to close. One journalist once wrote, "Medellín is not haunted by Pablo Escobar. Medellín is haunted by what it allowed him to be." The city did not just remember him. It remembered its complicity, its silence, its bargains. That was the real ghost, not his face, but the collective memory of what power costs. But history has a strange mercy. Even as it devours the guilty, it allows the living to rebuild. As Escobar's empire crumbled, Medellín began to rediscover itself. Through community programs, art, and public spaces. The same neighborhoods that once trembled began to paint again, to sing again, to breathe. Escobar's death did not end Medellín's suffering overnight, but it lifted the veil of inevitability. The people realized that peace, fragile as it was, could belong to them. The ghost that once hovered over every corner began to fade, not erased, but transformed into memory. The city learned something profound, that the opposite of fear is not courage, but creation. Art became rebellion. Music became resistance. Poetry became the new weapon. The youth, born after the storm, chose color over gray, song over silence. They began to speak of Medellín not as a wound, but as a promise. Still, every city carries its scars. Every night, when the lights dim and the hills go quiet, the memory stirs. The older generation still sees ghosts in alleyways. Some say they can feel his presence in the air, not as menace, but as a reminder of how far they've come. And perhaps that is the nature of ghosts. They remain, not to frighten, but to teach. Escobar's ghost belongs not to the man, but to the city. It lives in the stories parents tell, in the murals that cover the walls, in the quiet strength of those who endured. Medellín's ghost is not a curse. It is memory, alive. The narrator's voice lowers. Ghosts fade only when they are seen. Medellín saw its own and did not turn away. Every city that survives disaster must decide what kind of silence it will live with. The silence of forgetting or the silence of rebuilding. Medellín chose the latter. After decades of fear, the city began to speak again, slowly, gently, as if testing the sound of its own voice. The first signs of change were small: a park cleaned, a library built, a bus route extended into a forgotten neighborhood. They were gestures of faith. The people did not wait for saviors, they built their own. Out of the ruins of the 1990s, Medellín began a quiet revolution, not of violence, but of architecture, education, and art. The government called it urban transformation. The people called it hope. Cable cars climbed into neighborhoods that once hid in darkness. Public libraries rose in the hills like temples of knowledge. Escobar's ghost still lingered, but it had lost its shape, fading beneath murals, swallowed by color and community. Each project carried a story. The Biblioteca España, perched high above the city, looked like 3 black stones, monuments to endurance. Schools opened where gang outposts once stood. The people of Medellín were rebuilding not only streets, but memory. The city had learned that peace is not born from silence, it is born from participation. In the early 2000s, a new generation came of age, one that had never seen Escobar alive. They grew up hearing about him like a ghost story told by grandparents. But for them, Medellín was not his city, it was theirs. They filled it with music, dance, poetry, and murals that spoke to forgiveness rather than vengeance. Art became the city's new language. Murals told stories of loss and rebirth. Hip-hop groups spoke of justice and memory. Pain was not denied, it was painted. On walls that once held bullet holes, artists drew open skies. On corners where bodies once fell, children played again. The transformation wasn't simple. Ghosts resist change. Violence lingered in pockets of the city. The economy was uneven. Corruption never vanished. But hope had become habitual. Even on hard days, people looked up, literally. The city's geography forced it. Hills that demanded ascent, views that reminded its citizens that beauty still surrounded them. In those years, Medellín became something remarkable. Not just safer, but creative. It earned the title of the most innovative city in the world in 2013. For outsiders, this seemed impossible. For locals, it felt inevitable. Innovation here was not about technology, it was about survival. The city had learned how to turn wounds into blueprints. One architect said, "In Medellín, every brick has 2 purposes, to build and to heal." And indeed, every structure felt like a confession, an apology to the generations that came before. The city was finally speaking the words it had swallowed for so long. But transformation is not just physical, it is emotional. The people of Medellín began to reimagine their relationship with the past. Escobar's name was no longer sacred, nor entirely cursed. It was part of a longer story, one about resilience, responsibility, and redemption. Some of his old properties were repurposed, not destroyed, but redefined. The zoo at Hacienda Nápoles became a public theme park, filled with families and laughter. What was once a symbol of excess became a site of learning. History, when reclaimed by the people, loses its power to haunt. Tourism began to rise. Some came seeking the myth of Escobar, others seeking the miracle of Medellín. The locals responded with patience and pride. They told visitors not only of one man's empire, but of how an entire city survived it. The narrative had shifted. Medellín was no longer a city defined by a drug lord. It was a city defined by its refusal to stay broken. Still, remembrance remains sacred. Memorials were built for victims, not to reopen wounds, but to dignify them. Each name engraved was a light returned to history. The people came not to mourn, but to honor, to say, "You are not forgotten." The narrator's voice softens. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering without letting the memory rule you. The younger generation sees their city differently. They speak not of Escobar's Medellín, but of their Medellín, a city of coffee, music, and innovation. They walk through the same streets their parents feared, but now they walk freely, holding phones instead of prayers. To them, the past is not a burden. It's a foundation. Medellin's rebirth did not come from perfection. It came from persistence. The people chose not to erase their pain, but to grow around it, the way trees grow around old stones. And in doing so, they turned tragedy into texture, something that made the city not scarred, but alive.
Even now, late at night, the city hums with energy, not fear, but purpose. The lights scattered across the hills look like constellations reborn, the valley pulsing softly with human warmth. The fire that once consumed Medellín has become its light. The narrator whispers, "Once the fire destroyed, now it illuminates." Every city has a soul. Some whisper it, some hide it, and some, like Medellín, carry it like a ghost that refuses to leave. The ghost here does not haunt through terror, but through memory. It walks softly through the alleys of Santo Domingo, pauses beneath the electric hum of cable cars, and disappears into the rhythm of the night. It is not Pablo Escobar himself who lingers, not really. It is the echo of what his era did to the people who survived it. It is the silence left after years of noise. Old residents still remember the 1980s the way one remembers a recurring dream, not always real, but never forgotten. They speak of days when the city's heartbeat was uneven, when every radio broadcast carried both music and mourning. They speak softly, not out of fear anymore, but out of reverence for how fragile peace can be. In cafes, you can sometimes overhear older men telling stories, not about Escobar's power, but about the emptiness it left behind. One will stir his coffee and say, "He built houses for some, yes, but he buried the soul of the city." Another nods, "And now we're the ones digging it back up." Medellin's ghost lives in conversations like these, not visible but palpable. The city has grown modern, beautiful even, yet it carries a tension between pride and guilt, between celebration and remembrance. You can feel it in the air near La Catedral, Escobar's self-built prison. The jungle has begun to reclaim it. Vines winding around crumbling walls, birds nesting in empty watchtowers. Nature, patient and wordless, is doing what time always does, covering what man has done. Tour guides sometimes bring visitors there. They speak in low tones, describing how the man who once ruled a nation's fear lived behind those walls. But even the guides pause sometimes, as if uncertain how much of that story should still be told. Elsewhere in the city, Escobar's image has become commercial, printed on T-shirts, souvenirs, Netflix thumbnails. The younger generation sees him less as a man and more as a myth, part villain, part folktale. Some wear his face ironically, others ignorantly. But behind the irony lies a deeper question. Can a city ever truly outlive its myth? The city's elders do not like this. They sigh, shake their heads, and turn away. They remember a time when that face was not fashion, but fear. For them, memory is sacred. They know what it cost. But ghosts cannot be erased. They can only be transformed. Medellín has done this better than most. The city does not deny its ghost. It speaks to it. The murals in Comuna 13, the memorials for victims, the music of the new generation, all of it is dialogue. The ghost is no longer feared. It is listened to. And in being listened to, it loses its power. There is something extraordinary in how the city chose to live with its past. Not through denial,
but through art. Pain here has rhythm. Memory has melody. Every performance, every painting, every poem feels like a conversation with absence. At night, musicians play on rooftops. Their songs echo down the slopes, weaving between buildings, carrying words the city once could not speak aloud. We are still here, they sing. We are still dreaming. In the center of the city, there is a sculpture by Fernando Botero called The Bird of Peace. Beside it stands another, identical but torn apart, blackened by an explosion decades ago. The two are left side by side, one wounded, one whole. Botero insisted they remain together, a reminder that peace must stand next to memory, or it becomes meaningless. The people walk by them daily, some barely glancing, others stopping for a moment. The sight has become ordinary, but in its ordinariness lies the miracle, the normalization of peace. Because that is the real story of Medellín, not the empire of cocaine, nor the fall of a king. The real story is quieter, the way a city can forgive itself. In the alleys of Comuna 13, an old woman paints her wall bright yellow. She does it every year. It keeps the ghosts away, she says. But perhaps she's wrong. Perhaps it invites them, only to show them how much things have changed. Medellín is no longer defined by Escobar's shadow, yet the city's heartbeat still carries his echo, not as dominance, but as memory. It reminds everyone who lives there that power, when unchecked, consumes everything, even the one who wields it. Some nights, when the city is still, the ghost walks again, not as a man, but as a whisper. It moves between murals, along the cable cars, across bridges that once divided the living from the dead. It looks down at the city it once ruled, and perhaps, for the first time, it smiles, because Medellín no longer belongs to him. It belongs to the people who survived him. And that is immortality of a different kind. The true ghost of Medellín, the narrator whispers, is not the man who haunted it, but the city that learned to live again.